She walked back into the house of her own destruction, not to beg, but to conquer. 20 years ago, Clara Whitmore was destroyed in a ballroom, humiliated, rejected, and cast out by the man she loved. Duke Adrian Blackridge chose duty over her heart, leaving her broken before an audience of aristocrats who feasted on her shame. But Clara didn't stay broken. She rebuilt herself in fire and will, becoming a force the world couldn't ignore. Now, an invitation has arrived, one that could undo everything she's fought to become. Will she face the man who shattered her, or will the past finally claim its revenge? Stay until the end to see how this story transforms. Drop a like and comment with your city. I want to know where you're watching from. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Clara Whitmore stood at the window of her modest townhouse in the merchant quarter of Greymont, watching rain batter the cobblestones below. The envelope in her hand was thick, cream-colored, sealed with black wax and stamped with a crest she'd spent 20 years trying to forget, a raven perched atop a thorned shield. The Blackridge family seal. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Bellamy, hovered near the doorway, wringing her hands in her apron. "Miss Clara, you've gone white as a sheet. Is it bad news?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She turned the envelope over, studying the elegant script that spelled out her name. Miss Clara Whitmore. Not lady. Never lady. That title had been stolen from her long ago, in a ballroom full of glittering chandeliers and cold, judging eyes. "It's an invitation," Clara said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "To the Blackridge estate. A gala celebrating the Duke's 25th year of marriage." Mrs. Bellamy gasped. "Surely you won't go." Clara set the letter on the table and walked to the fireplace, where a modest fire crackled against the autumn chill. She stared into the flames, remembering another fire, a grand hearth in a ballroom where she'd once stood in a borrowed gown, young and foolish and full of hope. "I don't know yet," she murmured, but that was a lie. She already knew. 20 years ago, Clara had been a different woman entirely, younger, softer, desperate to belong in a world that had never wanted her. She'd been the daughter of a country doctor, a man of modest means but fierce intelligence, who'd saved the life of Duke Adrian Blackridge's father during a hunting accident. In gratitude, the old Duke had invited Clara's family to the estate for a summer, a gesture meant to be kind but that ultimately became Clara's undoing. She'd been 17, Adrian had been 22, handsome and arrogant in the way only the highest born could afford to be. He was everything her world wasn't, polished, powerful, untouchable. And for one brief, intoxicating summer, he'd noticed her. They'd walked the gardens at twilight. He'd read her poetry beneath the oak trees. He'd kissed her once behind the stables, his hands gentle on her face as if she were something precious. She'd believed, with the naive certainty of youth, that love could transcend the rigid boundaries of class and blood. She'd been wrong. The night of the Grand Harvest Ball, Adrian's father had announced his son's engagement to Lady Isadora Harrington, a woman of impeccable breeding and fortune. Clara had been standing in the ballroom when the news broke, wearing a gown she'd sewn herself, her heart still fluttering with the memory of Adrian's kiss. She'd watched him take Isadora's hand, watched him bow to the applause, watched him avoid her gaze as if she were invisible. When she'd tried to speak to him later, cornering him in a hallway, he'd looked at her with something worse than cruelty, pity. "Clara," he'd said softly, "you must understand. This is how the world works. I have responsibilities, duties. You were a lovely distraction, but that's all this could ever be." The words had cut deeper than any blade, but it was what happened next that had truly destroyed her. In her desperation, Clara had done something reckless. She'd gone to the ballroom, her emotions unraveling, and she'd confronted Adrian in front of everyone, lords and ladies, politicians and merchants, all the people who mattered in this unforgiving world. She'd accused him of lying, of using her, of breaking promises he'd never truly made. Her voice had cracked. Tears had streamed down her face, and the room had watched in horrified fascination as she unraveled. Adrian had said nothing. He'd simply turned away, his face carved from stone, and walked back to Isadora's side. The laughter had started then, quiet at first, then louder. Whispers turned to open mockery. Poor girl. Thought she could marry a duke. How pathetic. By the time Clara stumbled from the ballroom, her humiliation was complete. Her father, mortified, had taken her home that very night. Within a month, the doctor was dead. Some said from shame, others from a broken heart. Clara had been left alone, penniless, and branded with a scandal that followed her like a shadow. For 2 years, she'd lived in the dark. She'd worked as a seamstress, a tutor, anything to survive. She'd worn shame like a second skin, flinching at every whisper, every pitying glance. The world had written her off as a cautionary tale, a foolish girl who'd reached too high and fallen hard. But Clara Whitmore had learned something in the dark. She didn't need the world's approval to survive. She only needed herself. She'd started small. Using the modest inheritance her father had hidden away, she'd opened a school for the daughters of tradesmen. Girls like her, smart and capable, but locked out of society's upper tiers. She'd taught them reading, arithmetic, and something more important, dignity. She'd shown them that worth wasn't granted by birth or title, but earned through resilience and skill. The school had grown. Within 5 years, Clara had opened 3 more, each funded by careful investments and an iron will. She'd learned to navigate the world of commerce, to negotiate with merchants and bankers who underestimated her because of her sex and her past. She'd turned their contempt into leverage, their dismissal into opportunity. By the time she was 30, Clara Whitmore was no longer a scandal. She was a force, wealthy, respected, untouchable. She funded orphanages, libraries, apprenticeships. She moved through society with quiet confidence, never seeking approval but commanding it nonetheless. She'd rebuilt herself from ash and bone, and she owed no one, not even Adrian Blackridge, an explanation. And yet, here was his invitation. Mrs. Bellamy brought her tea, setting the cup gently on the table. "You've worked so hard to put that man behind you, Miss Clara. Why would you go back?" Clara picked up the letter again, reading the elegant script. The gala was in 3 weeks, a celebration of 25 years of marriage, a marriage built on duty and propriety, a marriage that had crushed her heart like glass. "Because," Clara said slowly, "I need to see him." "Why?" Clara looked at her housekeeper, her expression unreadable. "Because I need to know if I've truly moved on, or if I'm still that girl in the ballroom, waiting for him to turn around." Mrs. Bellamy shook her head. "You're not that girl anymore, Miss Clara. Anyone with eyes can see that." "Then I'll go," Clara said, her voice firm now. "And I'll prove it. Not to him. To myself." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Clara commissioned a gown from the finest dressmaker in Greymont. Not a borrowed dress this time, but one that fit her like armor. Deep emerald silk, tailored perfectly to her frame, with a neckline that spoke of confidence, not desperation. She wore her hair up, severe and elegant, and chose jewelry that was understated but expensive, pearls that glowed against her skin like captured moonlight. When she looked at herself in the mirror the night before the gala, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This wasn't the Clara who'd begged Adrian for scraps of affection. This was someone else entirely, someone who'd survived the fall and climbed back up on her own terms. The journey to the Blackridge estate took a full day by carriage. Clara spent the hours staring out the window, watching the countryside roll past, golden fields and dense forests, villages where children played in the dirt and women hung laundry on lines. This was the world she'd built her life in, far from the marble halls and crystal chandeliers of the aristocracy. As the sun began to set, the estate came into view. It was even grander than she remembered. The mansion sprawled across a hilltop, its stone facade glowing in the dying light. Gardens stretched in every direction, immaculate and perfect, bordered by hedges that had been sculpted into unnatural shapes. This was a world built on control, on the illusion that beauty could mask cruelty. Clara's carriage joined a line of others, each one disgorging lords and ladies in their finest attire. She waited her turn, her heart pounding despite her resolve. When the footman opened her door and offered his hand, she stepped out with the grace of someone who belonged. The ballroom was exactly as she remembered. Vaulted ceilings, glittering chandeliers, walls lined with portraits of Blackridge ancestors who stared down with cold, judging eyes. Music swirled through the air, mingling with laughter and the clink of champagne glasses. The room was packed with the elite of the kingdom, all of them dressed to prove their worth. Clara entered alone, her head high, her expression calm. She felt eyes turn toward her, heard the whispers start. "Who is that? Is that Clara Whitmore? The one from the scandal?" Let them whisper. She was no longer afraid of their words. And then she saw him. Adrian Blackridge stood at the far end of the ballroom, surrounded by a cluster of admirers. He was older now, lines etched into his face, gray threading through his dark hair, but he still carried himself with the same arrogance, the same effortless command of the room. His wife, Lady Isadora, stood beside him, a vision of cold perfection in silver and diamonds. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Clara watched him, her pulse steady. She waited for the flood of emotion, anger, pain, longing, but none came. Instead, she felt nothing, or perhaps not nothing, curiosity. She wanted to see what he would do when he saw her. She didn't have to wait long. Adrian's gaze swept the room, a practiced motion of someone used to surveying his domain. And then his eyes landed on her. For a moment he froze, his champagne glass halfway to his lips. His face went pale. He stared at her as if she were a ghost, something impossible made flesh. Clara smiled, a small, controlled smile that revealed nothing. Then she turned away, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server, and moved deeper into the crowd. Let him come to her. She was done chasing. The evening unfolded in a careful dance. Clara moved through the ballroom with practiced ease, speaking to merchants and minor nobles, deflecting questions about her past with polite but firm redirects. She was here, but she would not explain herself. She would not perform her pain for their entertainment. Adrian watched her from across the room. She could feel his gaze like a weight, but she refused to acknowledge it. Let him stew in his confusion. Let him wonder why she'd come. It wasn't until midnight, when the dancing had begun in earnest, that he finally approached her. Clara was standing near a window, watching couples spin across the marble floor, when she heard his voice behind her. "Clara." She turned slowly, her expression neutral. Up close, he looked even older, worn down by years of something she couldn't name. His eyes, once bright with confidence, were shadowed. "Your Grace," she said, her tone polite but distant. He flinched at the formality. I didn't expect you to come. And yet you invited me." "I did." He hesitated, his hands clenched at his sides. "I needed to see you." "Why?" The question hung between them, sharp and unyielding. Adrian opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "Because I owe you an apology." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You've had 20 years to apologize, Your Grace. Why now?" "Because—" He stopped, struggling for words. "Because I've spent those 20 years regretting what I did to you, and I needed you to know that." Clara studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she set her champagne glass on a nearby table and turned back to the window. "Your regret is not my burden to carry," she said quietly. "I came here tonight to prove something to myself, that I am no longer the girl you broke. And I've proven it. That's all I needed." Clara hit. "Good night, Your Grace." She walked away, leaving him standing alone by the window, his apology dying on his lips. As Clara descended the grand staircase toward the waiting carriages, she felt something shift inside her, a final, quiet release. The past no longer had power over her. She was free. But as her carriage pulled away from the estate, she glanced back one last time. Adrian stood on the steps, watching her leave, his face etched with something that looked almost like desperation. Clara turned away and didn't look back again. The carriage had barely disappeared down the tree-lined drive when Adrian felt the full weight of her absence settle over him like a shroud. He stood on the steps of his ancestral home, the sounds of the gala filtering out through the open doors behind him, laughter, music, the clink of crystal, all of it suddenly unbearable. He'd spent 25 years building this life, this facade of respectability and duty, and in the span of a single evening, Clara Whitmore had walked through it like smoke through a screen door, revealing every crack, every hollow space he'd been trying to ignore. "Adrian?" He turned to find Isadora standing in the doorway, her silver gown catching the lamplight. She was beautiful in the way a marble statue was beautiful, perfect, cold, untouchable. They'd shared a bed for 25 years, produced two sons who were off at university, attended countless balls and state dinners together. But they'd never shared anything that mattered. "You've been out here for 20 minutes, she said, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone used to managing inconveniences. "Lord Pemberton is asking for you. Something about the Trade Commission." "Tell him I'll be there shortly." Isadora's eyes narrowed slightly. "That woman, the one in the green dress. I know who she is." Adrian looked at his wife, seeing the calculation in her gaze. Isadora had always known about Clara, not the details perhaps, but the essence of it. She'd married him knowing his heart wasn't fully his to give. It was one of the many unspoken agreements that formed the foundation of their union. "She was a guest," Adrian said carefully. "Nothing more. She was the girl from the scandal, the doctor's daughter who made a fool of herself at your father's ball." Isadora stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "I wondered if you'd actually invite her. I didn't think you'd have the audacity. It was a mistake." "No." Isadora's smile was thin and sharp. "It was honest. Perhaps the first honest thing you've done in our entire marriage." She turned back toward the ballroom, then paused. "Whatever you're planning, Adrian, be discreet. I won't be humiliated, not after everything I've endured." She left him there, and Adrian realized with a cold clarity that his wife didn't care if he pursued Clara. She only cared about appearances. The revelation should have brought relief, but instead it felt like another door closing, another confirmation that his life had become a series of elegant prison cells. He went back inside and played his role for the rest of the evening, the gracious host, the devoted husband, the respected duke. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of Clara's appearance, the way she'd moved through the ballroom with quiet confidence, as if she owned the air itself, the way she'd looked at him, not with anger or pain, but with indifference, as if he were a stranger, as if he no longer mattered. That indifference had cut deeper than any accusation could have. When the last guest had departed and the servants had begun cleaning up the debris of celebration, Adrian retreated to his study. He poured himself a whiskey and stood by the window, staring out at the darkened gardens where he'd once walked with Clara, reading her poetry he didn't understand, making promises he'd been too weak to keep. He'd spent 20 years telling himself he'd made the right choice. Duty over desire. Responsibility over love. His father had demanded it, society had expected it, and he'd complied because that was what men of his station did. They sacrificed their hearts on the altar of legacy and lineage. But watching Clara walk away tonight, Adrian had finally understood the true cost of that sacrifice. He hadn't just lost her, he'd lost himself. The question was whether there was anything left worth salvaging. Well, the gossip reached Clara before the week was out. She was in her office at the Whitmore Academy, her flagship school in the Merchant Quarter, reviewing applications from prospective students when Mrs. Bellamy burst in, her face flushed with agitation. "You need to see this." She thrust a society newspaper onto Clara's desk, her finger jabbing at a column near the bottom of the page. Clara picked it up, her expression calm, even as she felt her pulse quicken. The headline read, "Mystery Guest at Blackridge Gala Stirs Old Scandals." The article was brief but pointed. It described Clara's appearance at the gala, noting her transformed appearance and questionable presence at such a distinguished event. It stopped just short of naming her directly, but anyone who remembered the scandal 20 years ago would know exactly who they were discussing. The final line made her jaw tighten. One wonders what business a woman of her background has at such an exclusive gathering. Old ghosts, it seems, refuse to stay buried. "Vultures," Mrs. Bellamy muttered. "They can't stand to see you succeed." Clara set the paper down, forcing her breathing to remain steady. She'd known this might happen. Returning to that world, even for a single night, had been a risk. But she'd taken it anyway because she'd needed to prove, to herself, that she could. "It doesn't matter," Clara said, though her knuckles were white where they gripped the desk. "Words in a newspaper can't undo what I've built." But over the next few days, she realized how wrong she was. The first blow came from the Greymont Ladies Auxiliary, a charitable organization that had been funding scholarships for Clara's schools. A letter arrived, politely informing her that due to shifting priorities, They would be discontinuing their support effective immediately. No explanation, no apology. The second blow was more direct. 3 families withdrew their daughters from the academy, citing concerns about the school's reputation. Clara met with each family personally, but their minds were made up. One father, a prosperous textile merchant, had been brutally honest. "You're a talented woman, Miss Whitmore, but I can't have my daughter associated with scandal. Not if I want her to make a good marriage." The third blow came from the bank. Clara had been negotiating a loan to open a new school in the Northern District, a poor area where education was desperately needed. The banker, Mr. Thornhill, had been enthusiastic about the project for months, but when Clara arrived for their scheduled meeting, his enthusiasm had evaporated. "I'm afraid the board has decided not to move forward," he said, not meeting her eyes. "The risk profile has changed." "Changed how?" Clara kept her voice level. "Nothing about the project has changed. The plans are solid, the need is proven, and my track record speaks for itself." Thornhill shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's not about the project, Miss Whitmore. It's about perception. The board feels that recent events have made you a liability." Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. "Recent events? You mean my attendance at a gala I was formally invited to?" "I mean the attention it's brought. People are talking, and when people talk, investors get nervous." He finally looked at her, and there was genuine regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, truly, but this is a business decision." Clara stood, gathering her papers with deliberate care. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Thornhill. Thank you for your time." She walked out of the bank with her head high, but inside she was reeling. This was the world she lived in, one where a single night at a ball could undo years of hard work, where reputation mattered more than results, where old scandals could be weaponized against anyone who dared to rise above their station. By the time she returned to her townhouse, the anger had settled into something harder, colder: determination. Mrs. Bellamy was waiting for her in the sitting room, wringing her hands. "There's a visitor, Miss Clara. He's been waiting for over an hour. I told him you weren't receiving, but he insisted." "Who?" "The Duke of Blackridge." Clara froze, her hand on the doorframe. For a moment she considered turning around, leaving through the back entrance, avoiding this confrontation entirely. But that would be cowardice, and Clara Whitmore was done running. "Show him in," she said quietly. Adrian was standing by the window when she entered, his hands clasped behind his back. He'd traded his formal attire for simpler clothes, a dark coat and trousers, no medals or ceremonial trappings. He looked tired, older than he had at the gala, as if the past week had aged him years. He turned when she entered, and something flickered across his face. Relief, maybe, or anxiety. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for seeing me." Clara remained by the door, her posture rigid. "You have 5 minutes, Your Grace. I have a school to run." He flinched at her coldness, but nodded. "I came to apologize for the article, for the consequences you're facing because of my invitation." "Your invitation?" Clara's laugh was sharp. "I chose to attend. I knew the risks. You don't get to claim responsibility for my choices. But the fallout is mine to handle." She crossed her arms. "Was there anything else?" Adrian took a step forward, then stopped, as if hitting an invisible wall. "I also came to ask, to offer." He struggled for words, his usual eloquence deserting him. "I have influence, connections. If the banks are refusing you funding, I can speak to them. I can make sure your schools continue to operate." The offer hung in the air between them, and Clara felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. The same anger she'd felt 20 years ago when he'd looked at her with pity. "Let me be very clear, Your Grace," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I don't want your money. I don't want your influence. I don't want anything from you except for you to leave me alone. I built this life without you. I'll maintain it without you." "Clara, Miss Whitmore," she corrected sharply. "We are not friends. We are not confidants. You are a duke who once knew a girl who no longer exists. That's all." Adrian's face went pale, but he didn't back down. "I know I hurt you. I know I destroyed something precious, but I'm trying to make amends." "Why?" The question came out harsher than she intended. "Why now?" Because you saw me at your gala and realized I'd become something despite you? Because your guilt finally caught up with you? Or because you're bored in your loveless marriage and thought I might be a convenient distraction? The accusation landed like a slap. Adrian stepped back, his expression stricken. That's not... I would never. Wouldn't you? Clara moved closer, her eyes blazing. You've spent 25 years as a duke, Adrian. You're used to getting what you want, used to people bowing and scraping and thanking you for scraps of your attention. But I'm not that girl anymore. I don't need your rescue. I don't need your redemption. I need you to leave. For a long moment, he just stood there, his jaw working as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. Then, slowly, he nodded. You're right, he said quietly. About all of it. I have no right to ask anything of you, but I want you to know, seeing you again, seeing what you've become, it made me realize how much I wasted, how much I threw away. Not just you, myself. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. I won't bother you again, Miss Whitmore, but if you ever need anything, anything at all, you have my word that I'll help. No strings, no expectations, just a debt being paid. He left before she could respond, the door clicking softly shut behind him. Clara stood in the empty room, her hands trembling with residual anger and something else she couldn't name. She wanted to feel triumphant. She'd rejected him, turned away his help, proven she didn't need him. But instead she felt hollow, as if the confrontation had drained something vital from her. Mrs. Bellamy appeared in the doorway, her expression worried. Are you all right, Miss Clara? I'm fine. Clara straightened her shoulders, forcing strength back into her voice. Send word to the Board of Trustees. We're meeting tomorrow morning. If the banks won't fund us, we'll find another way. Because that's what Clara did. She found another way. But finding another way proved harder than she'd anticipated. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara exhausted every option. She approached private investors, appealed to philanthropists, even considered selling some of her own assets. But the scandal had spread faster than plague, and doors that had once been open were now firmly closed. People were afraid of association, afraid that supporting her would taint their own reputations. The schools continued to operate, but barely. Clara dipped into her personal savings to cover salaries and expenses, knowing it was unsustainable. At night, she lay awake doing calculations in her head, trying to figure out how long she could keep this up before everything collapsed. It was during one of these sleepless nights that the letter arrived. Not from Adrian this time, but from someone she'd never expected. Lady Margaret Thornberry, one of the kingdom's wealthiest widows and a known philanthropist. The letter was brief and to the point. Miss Whitmore, I have heard of your recent difficulties and would like to discuss a potential partnership. I believe our goals align in ways that could benefit both your institutions and my charitable interests. Please join me for tea tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Regards, Lady Margaret Thornberry. Clara read the letter 3 times, searching for a trap. Lady Margaret was notoriously selective about her associations, supporting only causes she deemed worthy. Why would she reach out now, when everyone else was fleeing? There was only one way to find out. Lady Margaret's townhouse was in the most exclusive district of Greymont, a mansion that spoke of old wealth and older power. Clara was shown into a sitting room filled with artwork and books, where a woman in her 60s sat by the fire, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes sharp and assessing. Miss Whitmore, Lady Margaret said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Thank you for coming. I hope you don't mind my directness, but I find that small talk is a waste of time at my age. I prefer directness, Lady Margaret. Good. The older woman poured tea with steady hands. I'll get straight to it then. I want to fund your new school, the full amount you were seeking from the bank, plus an additional sum for operational costs. Clara's carefully maintained composure cracked. I don't understand. Why would you... Because I've been watching you for 5 years, Miss Whitmore. I've seen what you've built, how you've transformed the lives of girls who would otherwise be forgotten by this society. Your work is remarkable, and I don't give a damn about some old scandal from 2 decades ago. Clara set down her teacup, her hands unsteady. Lady Margaret, I'm grateful, but I need to understand your conditions. In my experience, generosity at this level always comes with expectations. Lady Margaret's smile was approving. Smart girl. Yes, there are conditions. First, I want quarterly reports on the school's progress. Second, I want a seat on your board of trustees. And third, she paused, her expression growing serious. I want you to stop hiding. I'm not hiding. You are. You've built something extraordinary, but you've done it in the shadows, avoiding attention because you're afraid of judgment. That needs to end. If we're going to change this world, and make no mistake, that's what we're doing. We need to do it loudly, visibly. We need to show every girl in this kingdom that they don't need permission to be extraordinary. Clara felt something shift inside her, a door opening that she'd kept locked for years. The backlash will be severe. Let it come. We'll face it together. Lady Margaret leaned forward, her eyes fierce. I'm an old woman, Miss Whitmore. I've spent my life playing by society's rules, being quiet and proper and acceptable, but I'm done with that. And I think you are too. Clara thought about the past 2 weeks. The closed doors, the whispered insults, the constant pressure to shrink herself, to apologize for existing. She thought about the girls in her schools, watching her to see if it was possible to survive in a world that wanted them small. Yes, Clara said quietly. I'm done. Then we have a partnership. Lady Margaret extended her hand, and Clara took it, feeling the strength in the older woman's grip. Now, let's talk about how we're going to burn this system to the ground and build something better. The announcement came a week later, printed in every major newspaper in the kingdom. Lady Margaret Thornberry was funding the expansion of the Whitmore Academy system, with plans to open 10 new schools across the kingdom over the next 5 years. The article included a full interview with Clara, detailing her vision for education reform, her belief that intelligence and capability had nothing to do with birth or gender. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Half the kingdom celebrated it as a progressive step forward. The other half condemned it as dangerous radicalism. Clara's townhouse was flooded with letters, some supportive, many threatening. A group of conservative lords called for Lady Margaret to be stripped of her social standing. An editorial in the leading newspaper declared that Clara Whitmore was a danger to the natural order of society. But for every attack, there was a defense. Families began showing up at the schools, asking to enroll their daughters. Women wrote letters thanking Clara for giving them hope. And slowly, grudgingly, the tide began to turn. It was during this chaotic time that Adrian reappeared. Clara was working late in her office, reviewing architectural plans for the new schools, when Mrs. Bellamy knocked on the door. There's someone here to see you, Miss Clara. I told him you weren't receiving visitors, but he says it's urgent. Clara didn't need to ask who it was. She could feel it in the sudden tension in the air, the way her pulse quickened despite her best efforts to remain calm. Show him in. Adrian entered looking worse than he had during his last visit, his clothes rumpled, dark circles under his eyes, his usual polish completely absent. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. I'm sorry to come unannounced, he said, his voice rough. But I needed to warn you. Clara set down her pen. Warn me about what? There's a coalition forming, lords who are threatened by what you and Lady Margaret are doing. They're planning to petition the crown to shut down your schools, claiming they're promoting sedition and undermining social stability. Clara felt her blood run cold. Can they do that? They can try, and they have influence, enough to make it a real fight. Adrian moved closer, his expression urgent. Clara, you need to be careful. These men don't just want to stop your schools, they want to destroy you, to make an example of you. Let them try. Clara's voice was steady, but inside fear coiled tight. Everything she'd built could be wiped away with a single royal decree. This isn't a game, Adrian said sharply. These are dangerous men. They've ruined people for less. And what would you have me do? Bow down? Close the schools? Apologize for daring to challenge their precious social order? Clara stood, her hands flat on the desk. I won't do it, Adrian. I'd rather lose everything fighting than survive on my knees. He stared at her, and something in his expression shifted, admiration mixing with something deeper, something that made Clara's breath catch. I know, he said quietly. That's why I'm going to help you. I told you, I don't want your... I'm not offering charity. I'm offering alliance. Adrian straightened, and for the first time since entering, he looked like the duke he was, commanding, powerful, certain. I have influence too, And I'm tired of using it to prop up a system that's broken. If you'll let me, I want to use it for something that matters." Clara studied him, searching for the trap, the hidden motive. But all she saw was exhaustion and sincerity, and something that looked almost like desperation. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk everything for this?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because 20 years ago, I chose duty over what was right. I chose comfort over courage. And I've regretted it every day since. I can't undo the past, Clara, but maybe I can do something worthwhile with what's left of my future." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Clara felt her careful defenses wavering, felt the old anger beginning to crack. "If you do this," she said slowly, "you'll lose everything. Your standing, your reputation, possibly your title. I know. Your wife will leave you. Your sons may disown you. I know. And you might still fail. We might still lose." Adrian smiled then, a real smile, the first genuine one she'd seen from him in 20 years. "Then at least I'll lose fighting for something I believe in. That's more than I can say for the past 25 years of my life." Clara wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her independence, her pride, her righteous anger. But she was also practical, and she knew that this fight would take everything she had. Having Adrian as an ally could make the difference between survival and destruction. "All right," she said finally, "but understand this. I'm in charge. This is my fight, my vision. You follow my lead, not the other way around." Adrian's smile widened. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They shook hands across the desk, and Clara felt the world shift beneath her feet. This was no longer just about her schools or her redemption. This was about challenging the very foundations of the society that had once destroyed her. And she was going to win, or burn everything down trying. The alliance changed everything, though not in the way Clara had anticipated. Within days of their agreement, Adrian threw himself into the fight with a fervor that bordered on reckless. He called in favors from old colleagues, attended meetings with progressive members of parliament, and publicly defended Clara's schools and salons and clubs where her name had become synonymous with rebellion. His involvement didn't stop the attacks. If anything, it intensified them. But it shifted the battlefield. This was no longer just about a woman overstepping her station. This was about a duke abandoning his class. The Conservative coalition, led by Earl Harrington, Isadora's father, saw Adrian's defection as a personal betrayal and responded with calculated viciousness. Anonymous pamphlets appeared on street corners, accusing Clara of seducing the Duke to gain power, painting her as a manipulative social climber who'd never let go of her obsession. The attacks were crude but effective, designed to undermine her credibility while simultaneously humiliating Adrian. Clara read one of the pamphlets in her office, her jaw tight with fury. The language was deliberately inflammatory. The Scarlet Seductress and her noble fool, how a disgraced woman ensnared a duke. It included a caricature of her in a provocative pose, with Adrian depicted as a lovesick puppy at her feet. "They're trying to make this about sex," Lady Margaret said, standing by the window with her own copy of the pamphlet. "Because they can't win on the actual issues. Education reform, women's rights, those arguments scare them. So they're turning it into a scandal." "It's working." Clara crumpled the paper in her fist. 3 more families withdrew their daughters this morning. The board is panicking. "Let them panic. We knew this would get ugly." Lady Margaret turned, her expression fierce despite her age. "The question is, how do we respond?" Before Clara could answer, the door burst open. Adrian strode in without knocking, his face flushed with anger, a newspaper clutched in his hand. "Have you seen this?" He slammed the paper on Clara's desk. It was the morning edition of the Greymont Chronicle, the kingdom's most influential newspaper. The headline read, "Duke Blackridge's wife files for legal separation, cites adultery and abandonment of duty." Clara's stomach dropped. Isadora went public? More than that, she gave an interview. Adrian's voice was raw. "She's claiming I've been having an affair with you for months, that I've neglected my responsibilities to the estate, to my family, to my title, all because I'm obsessed with a woman who humiliated me 20 years ago and is now using me for revenge against society." "That's insane," Clara said, standing. "We've barely spoken in 20 years. Anyone who knows the truth doesn't matter." Adrian slammed his hand on the desk, making both women jump. This is politics. Isidore's father orchestrated this. He's using her to destroy both of us, to make you look like a home wrecker and me look like a fool. And it's going to work unless we do something drastic." Lady Margaret moved between them, her voice cutting through the tension. "Then we do something drastic. What do you propose?" Adrian looked at Clara, and she saw something desperate in his eyes, something that made her pulse quicken with alarm. "We tell the truth," he said, "all of it. We hold a public forum and explain exactly what happened 20 years ago, why you're doing this work now, and why I'm supporting you. We take away their ammunition by being completely transparent." "That's suicide," Clara said flatly. "You'd have to admit you courted me under false pretenses, that you made promises you never intended to keep. You'd destroy what's left of your reputation." "My reputation is already destroyed, but yours isn't, not yet." Adrian's voice softened. "If we do this right, we can turn the narrative. Show that you're not a seductress or a social climber. You're a survivor, someone who rebuilt herself after being crushed by a system that values bloodlines over humanity." Clara wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed that this was too dangerous, too exposing. But she could see the logic in it. They were losing the battle of public opinion because the lies were simpler than the truth. Scandal sold. Redemption was harder to package. "When?" she asked quietly. 3 days from now, the Merchants' Hall. We invite the press, the public, anyone who wants to hear." Adrian straightened, some of his old authority returning. "And we don't hold back." Lady Margaret nodded slowly. "It's risky, but staying silent is riskier. We're already bleeding support. This might be our only chance to stop the hemorrhaging." Clara looked between them, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just about the schools anymore. This was about standing up in front of the entire kingdom and ripping open old wounds, exposing vulnerabilities she'd spent 2 decades armoring over. "All right," she said, "but we do it my way. I tell my story in my words. Nobody speaks for me." Adrian's relief was palpable. "Agreed." "And Adrian?" Clara's voice hardened. "If we're telling the truth, we tell all of it, including the parts that make you look like a coward. No sanitizing, no excuses." He met her gaze without flinching. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Clara wrote and rewrote her statement, each draft stripping away another layer of protection until what remained was raw and honest and terrifying. Lady Margaret handled the logistics, securing the venue, sending invitations to every newspaper in the kingdom, making sure the event would be too big to ignore. And Adrian disappeared. Clara didn't see him at all during those 3 days. She heard reports. He was meeting with lawyers, with family, with old friends. Apparently his sons had returned from university to confront him about the scandal. The rumors said it hadn't gone well. The night before the public forum, Clara couldn't sleep. She paced her townhouse, rehearsing her statement in her head, imagining all the ways this could go wrong. What if the crowd turned hostile? What if the press twisted her words? What if she stood up there and found that 20 years of carefully constructed strength crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny? At midnight, there was a knock on her door. Mrs. Bellamy appeared in her nightgown, looking worried. "There's someone in the garden, Miss Clara." "A man. He says he needs to speak with you." Clara's first thought was Adrian, but when she went to the window, she saw a different figure standing among the hedges, younger, well-dressed, with Adrian's distinctive profile, one of his sons. She went down to the garden, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. The young man turned as she approached, and she saw the resemblance clearly now. He had Adrian's dark hair and sharp cheekbones, but his eyes were all Isidora's, cold and calculating. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm Thomas Blackridge, the Duke's eldest son." "I know who you are." "Then you know I have every reason to despise you." He moved closer, and Clara saw the fury radiating off him like heat. "My father has destroyed our family for you. My mother is humiliated. Our name is being dragged through the mud. And for what? Some misguided attempt at redemption for a mistake he made 2 decades ago?" Clara kept her voice level. "Your father made his own choices. I didn't ask for his help." "Didn't you?" Thomas's laugh was bitter. "You show up at our house after 20 years, looking like some kind of avenging angel, and you expect me to believe you had no agenda? That you didn't want to remind him of what he lost? I went to prove to myself that I'd moved on, that's all. And did you? Move on? The question was sharp, probing. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're using my father's guilt to advance your own interests. You're no different from any other social climber, you're just more clever about it. The accusation stung because it echoed Clara's own fears. She'd told herself that accepting Adrian's help was pragmatic, strategic, but was there a part of her that enjoyed watching him sacrifice everything for her? A part that wanted him to suffer the way she'd suffered? Your father is a grown man, Clara said quietly. He doesn't need your permission or mine to decide what's worth fighting for. If you want to blame someone for your family's troubles, blame the society that demands perfection and punishes honesty. Thomas stepped back, his expression hardening. Tomorrow's form is a mistake. You're going to make everything worse. And when it all falls apart, when the mob turns on you and the crown shuts down your schools, don't say I didn't warn you. He left without waiting for a response, disappearing into the darkness beyond the garden wall. Clara stood alone among the hedges, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. Thomas's words echoed in her mind, mixing with her own doubts. Was she making a terrible mistake? Was she about to destroy everything, her schools, her reputation, Adrian's remaining dignity, for the sake of truth that nobody really wanted to hear? She didn't have an answer. She only knew that turning back now would be admitting defeat. And Clara Whitmore didn't know how to do that anymore. Bam! The merchant's hall was packed. Clara arrived an hour before the scheduled start time, and already the crowd was spilling out into the street. Reporters from every major newspaper jostled for position, their notebooks ready. In the front rows sat members of parliament, wealthy merchants, progressive activists, and to Clara's surprise, dozens of young women, many of them current or former students from her schools. Lady Margaret met her backstage, looking unusually nervous. The opposition is here in force. Earl Harrington brought half the House of Lords. They're planning to disrupt the proceedings. Let them try. Clara's voice was steadier than she felt. Is Adrian here? Not yet. He sent word that he'd arrive before you speak, but Lady Margaret trailed off, her worry evident. Clara felt a flicker of panic. What if he'd changed his mind? What if the pressure from his family had been too much? She forced the thoughts away. She'd survived worse than being abandoned. If Adrian didn't show, she'd face this alone, just like she'd faced everything else. At exactly 2 o'clock, Clara walked onto the stage. The crowd erupted, some in applause, many in jeers and shouts. Clara stood at the podium, waiting for the noise to subside, refusing to let the hostility shake her. She could see Earl Harrington in the third row, his face twisted with contempt. She could see reporters leaning forward, hungry for scandal. She could see her students watching with a mixture of hope and fear. And she could see the empty chair beside the podium, where Adrian was supposed to be sitting. The hall finally quieted, and Clara began to speak. 20 years ago, I was humiliated in a ballroom not far from here. I was 17 years old, the daughter of a country doctor, and I'd made the mistake of believing that love could transcend the boundaries of class and station. I was wrong. The man I loved, Duke Adrian Blackridge, chose duty over affection, as he'd been raised to do. And I responded to that rejection by making a spectacle of myself, confirming every prejudice society held about girls like me, that we were emotional, irrational, unworthy of respect. She paused, letting the words settle. Some members of the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, curious despite themselves. I don't tell you this to gain sympathy. I tell you this because what happened to me happens to countless girls every day in this kingdom. We're taught that our worth depends on men's approval, on marriage, on fitting into a system designed to keep us small and silent. And when we dare to want more, when we dare to love someone beyond our station, or pursue education, or challenge the rules, we're destroyed for it. That's enough! Earl Harrington stood, his voice booming across the hall. This is not the place for radical propaganda. We came here to hear an explanation for your seduction of a married nobleman, not a sermon on social reform. Clara met his gaze without flinching. I have never seduced your son-in-law, Lord Harrington. In fact, I've spent the better part of 2 decades avoiding him entirely. It was the Duke who sought me out, not the other way around. If you want to accuse someone of impropriety, Perhaps you should start with the man who invited me to his home while his wife watched from across the ballroom. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara saw Harrington's face go purple with rage. "You dare! I dare quite a lot, actually." Clara's voice strengthened. "I dare to stand here and tell you that your daughter's marriage is loveless and has been for decades. I dare to suggest that the Duke's support of my schools has nothing to do with seduction and everything to do with a man trying to do something meaningful with the privilege he was born into. And I dare to say that the real scandal isn't my presence at a gala or the Duke's choice to help fund education for girls. The real scandal is a society so afraid of change that it would rather destroy people than admit its own failures." The hall erupted in chaos. Some people cheered, others shouted abuse. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. And through it all, Clara stood firm, her hands gripping the podium, refusing to back down. It was in the midst of this chaos that Adrian finally appeared. He didn't come through the main entrance. Instead, he walked onto the stage from the side door, disheveled and breathing hard, as if he'd been running. His clothes were dusty, his cravat askew, and there was a bruise forming on his jaw. He looked like he'd been in a fight. The crowd fell silent, shocked by his appearance. Adrian walked straight to Clara, ignoring the hundreds of eyes watching. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My sons tried to prevent me from coming. We had a disagreement." Clara stared at the bruise on his face, understanding dawning. "Thomas hit you." "He did, and I let him because he needed to." Adrian turned to face the crowd, and Clara saw something in his expression she'd never seen before: complete vulnerability. "My son is right to be angry. I've been a terrible father. I've been a terrible husband. I've spent 25 years hiding behind duty and propriety, using my title as an excuse to avoid difficult truths." He moved to the center of the stage, and Clara stepped back, letting him have the floor. "Clara Whitmore told you she was humiliated 20 years ago," Adrian continued, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "What she didn't tell you is that I'm the one who humiliated her. I courted her in secret, made her promises I had no intention of keeping, and then discarded her when my father demanded I marry someone suitable. I let her believe she mattered to me, and then I destroyed that belief in the most public, cruel way possible." He looked at Earl Harrington, his gaze unflinching. "You asked why I'm supporting Clara's schools, Lord Harrington. It's not because she seduced me. It's because I finally understood what I'd done to her. I watched her walk into my ballroom 3 weeks ago, transformed into someone extraordinary, and I realized the full extent of my cowardice. She survived what I did to her. She thrived. While I've spent 25 years in a prison of my own making, pretending I'd chosen honor when all I'd really chosen was fear." The hall was utterly silent now. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every eye in the room. "So here's the truth," Adrian said, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't deserve Clara's forgiveness. I don't deserve to be part of her work. But I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to earn it anyway. Not because I expect anything in return, but because it's the first honest thing I've done in decades." And then, to Clara's complete shock, Adrian dropped to his knees. Right there on the stage, in front of hundreds of witnesses, the Duke of Blackridge knelt before her. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was wrecked with emotion. "For everything I did to you, for every moment of pain I caused. You deserved better than me then, and you deserve better than me now. But if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I can become the man you needed me to be." Clara stood frozen, her mind reeling. This wasn't supposed to happen. She'd expected him to support her, to defend the schools, maybe to publicly acknowledge his past mistakes. But this complete surrender of pride, this public humiliation of himself, this was something else entirely. She looked out at the crowd and saw shock on every face. Even Earl Harrington seemed stunned into silence. The reporters were scribbling furiously, capturing every moment for tomorrow's headlines. And Clara realized, with sudden clarity, that this changed everything. Adrian had just destroyed himself. By kneeling before her, by admitting his failures so publicly, he'd violated every rule of aristocratic conduct. His peers would never forgive this display of weakness. His title might survive, but his standing wouldn't. He'd be a pariah, mocked and dismissed by the very society he'd been born to lead. He'd done it anyway. For her. Clara felt something crack inside her, some final wall she'd been maintaining between them. She'd spent 20 years hardening herself against him, building armor to protect the girl who'd been broken. But that girl was gone, and the woman standing here now had to make a choice: hold on to old anger or acknowledge what was being offered. She knelt down beside him, ignoring the gasps from the crowd. "Stand up, Adrian," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "You don't need to kneel to me." "Yes, I do." His eyes met hers, and she saw tears there. "I need to show everyone, that I understand, that I'm not the man I was, that I'm willing to be lower than dirt if that's what it takes to make this right." Clara felt her own eyes burning. "You've already proven that. Now stand up and help me finish what we started." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he stood. Clara rose with him, and they faced the crowd together. The hall erupted in chaos again, but this time Clara barely heard it. She turned to Adrian and said, "I forgive you." The words came out without planning, raw and honest, and she realized, saying them, that they were true. Not because he'd earned forgiveness through this grand gesture, but because she was tired of carrying the weight of old wounds, tired of letting the past define her future. But forgiveness didn't mean surrender. "I forgive you," she repeated, louder now so the crowd could hear. "But I won't give up my life for yours. I won't sacrifice what I've built to become your redemption story. If you want to help, you do it on my terms, as an ally, not as a savior." Adrian's smile was tremulous but genuine. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They stood together on that stage, facing a crowd divided between outrage and awe, and Clara felt the world shift beneath her feet. This was no longer about revenge or redemption. This was about something harder, more complex. Two people who destroyed each other trying to build something new from the ruins. The question was whether the world would let them. The answer came faster than Clara anticipated. The forum ended in chaos, with reporters rushing to file their stories and the crowd spilling into the streets, arguing about what they'd witnessed. Clara and Adrian left through a back entrance, flanked by Lady Margaret and a handful of supporters who'd volunteered to act as escorts. They barely made it 2 blocks before the violence started. A group of young men, aristocrats by their dress, emerged from an alley, their faces twisted with rage. "Traitor!" one of them screamed at Adrian. "You've disgraced your entire class!" Adrian stepped in front of Clara, but before he could speak, someone threw a rock. It hit him in the shoulder, hard enough to make him stumble. More projectiles followed. Mud, refuse, another rock that shattered against the wall behind them. "Get back!" Lady Margaret shouted, but the crowd was growing, feeding on its own anger. More people joined in, not all of them aristocrats. Some were working-class men and women who saw Clara as a threat to the natural order, an uppity woman who needed to be put in her place. The escorts tried to form a barrier, but they were outnumbered. Clara felt hands grabbing at her, heard voices screaming obscenities. Someone yanked her hair hard enough to make her cry out. Adrian roared and swung at the attacker, and then everything dissolved into violence. Clara fought back, using every dirty trick she'd learned in 2 decades of surviving in rough neighborhoods. She kicked, scratched, bit when necessary. But there were too many of them, and she could feel herself being pulled away from Adrian, from Lady Margaret, from safety. A hand closed around her wrist, yanking her toward the alley. She screamed, but the sound was lost in the chaos. She caught one last glimpse of Adrian, blood streaming from his nose, fighting through the crowd to reach her. Then something hard struck the back of her head, and the world went dark. Clara woke to darkness and the smell of mildew. Her head throbbed, and when she tried to move, she realized her hands were bound behind her back. Panic surged through her, sharp and immediate. "Easy," a voice said from somewhere nearby. "You've got a nasty bump on your head. Don't move too quickly." Clara's vision adjusted slowly to the dim light. She was in a cellar of some kind, windowless and cold. Across from her, also bound, was Adrian. His face was battered, one eye swollen shut, but he was conscious and watching her with fierce concern. "Where are we?" Clara's voice came out hoarse. "I don't know. They knocked us both out during the fight. We've been here for—" Adrian glanced at the small sliver of light beneath the door. "Maybe an hour? 2? Lady Margaret? I don't know. I hope she got away." Clara tested her bonds, but they were tight, expertly tied. Who did this? Before Adrian could answer, the door opened. Light flooded in, making both of them wince. A figure stepped into the cellar, backlit so Clara couldn't see their face clearly. Then they moved closer, and Clara's blood ran cold. Earl Harrington stood before them, his expression cold and satisfied. "Good," he said. "You're both awake. We have much to discuss." Earl Harrington circled them like a predator assessing wounded prey, his boots echoing against the stone floor of the cellar. Clara's head throbbed where she'd been struck, but she forced herself to focus, to assess their situation. The room was small, maybe 12 feet square, with walls of old brick that suggested they were beneath one of the older buildings in Greymont's warehouse district. A single oil lamp cast flickering shadows across Harrington's face, making him look more monster than man. "You've caused me considerable trouble," Harrington said, his voice conversational despite the violence of their abduction. "My daughter's reputation is in ruins. My political allies are questioning my judgment. And all because you couldn't accept your place in the world, Miss Whitmore." Clara met his gaze without flinching, though fear coiled tight in her chest. "If you're going to kill us, spare me the villain's monologue. Just do it." Harrington laughed, a cold sound devoid of humor. "Kill you? My dear girl, I'm not a murderer, I'm a problem solver. And you, both of you, represent a problem that requires a permanent solution. What do you want?" Adrian's voice was rough, strained through his swollen jaw. "I want you to disappear." Harrington crouched down to Adrian's eye level. "I have a ship leaving for the colonies tomorrow morning. You and Miss Whitmore will be on it, along with documents declaring you've abandoned your title in favor of your eldest son. You'll live out your days in comfortable exile, and this embarrassing episode will be remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of weakness and misplaced sentiment." "And if we refuse?" Clara asked. Harrington turned to her, his smile sharp. "Then I'll have you both declared mentally unfit. I have doctors who will testify that you, Miss Whitmore, have been suffering from delusions stemming from your initial breakdown 20 years ago. And you, Your Grace, have been compromised by her manipulations to the point of complete irrationality. You'll spend the rest of your lives in separate asylums, drugged into compliance, while I manage your estates and ensure your schools are dismantled brick by brick." The threat hung in the air, all the more terrifying because Clara knew he could do it. Men like Harrington had the connections, the wealth, and the complete absence of conscience required to make such things happen. She'd heard stories of inconvenient people disappearing into private institutions, their protestations dismissed as further evidence of madness. "You can't do this," Adrian said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "People saw us. They'll ask questions. People saw you attacked by an angry mob. In the confusion, you both fled, probably to avoid further violence. Very understandable, given the circumstances. By the time anyone thinks to look for you, you'll already be halfway across the ocean, or locked away where no one will ever find you." Harrington stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "I'm giving you 6 hours to decide. Choose wisely." He left, and Clara heard the heavy click of a lock engaging from the outside. They were alone in the darkness, bound and trapped, with no clear way out. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian said quietly, "I'm sorry, this is my fault. If I hadn't been so desperate to make amends." "Don't." Clara's voice was sharp. "We don't have time for self-recrimination. We need to think." "Think about what? He has us completely cornered. Even if we escape this cellar, where do we go? He'll have people watching every route out of the city. And if we try to go to the authorities, he'll just implement his backup plan faster." Clara tested her bonds again, feeling for any weakness in the rope. Her wrists were already raw from earlier attempts, but she kept working at it anyway. "There has to be a way out. There's always a way out." "Clara." "No." She turned to face him as much as her bindings allowed, her eyes fierce even in the dim light. "I didn't survive 20 years of this world trying to break me just to give up now. Harrington thinks he's cornered us, but he's made a mistake. He's told us exactly what he plans to do, which means we can prepare for it." "How?" "We're tied up in a cellar with no way to contact anyone." Clara's mind raced, sorting through possibilities. Harrington was arrogant. That was his weakness. He'd left them alone, confident his threats were enough to ensure compliance. But he'd also given them 6 hours, which suggested he needed time to prepare the ship, forge the documents, arrange the logistics of making 2 people vanish. 6 hours wasn't much, but it was something. "The ropes," Clara said suddenly. "They're not as tight as they could be." Whoever tied us wasn't expecting much resistance. They thought we'd be too frightened or injured to try escaping. Adrian looked skeptical, but started working his own bonds with renewed effort. "Even if we get free, the door is locked from the outside, and there's probably a guard. So we make them open it." "How?" Clara looked around the cellar, taking inventory. There wasn't much. Some old crates in the corner, the oil lamp, a few broken tools scattered on the floor. But sometimes survival wasn't about having the right tools. It was about using whatever you had with maximum creativity. "Can you reach that lamp?" she asked. Adrian stretched, his face contorting with pain from his injuries, but managed to hook his foot around the lamp's base and drag it closer. "What are you thinking?" "Fire," Clara said. "Old buildings like this, they're tinder boxes. If we can create enough smoke, whoever's guarding us will have to open that door. And when they do, we fight our way out." Adrian's expression shifted from despair to something like hope. "It's risky. We could actually burn to death if it goes wrong. Better than spending the rest of our lives drugged in separate asylums." Clara had finally worked one hand partially free, the rope burning her skin as she twisted and pulled. "Besides, Harrington doesn't want us dead. He wants us compliant. He'll make sure we don't actually burn. He'll just wait until we're desperate enough to surrender. And then? Then we don't surrender. We run." It took another 20 minutes for Clara to fully free her hands. Her wrists were bleeding, the skin torn raw, but she ignored the pain and immediately set to work on Adrian's bonds. His were tighter, more expertly tied, but eventually she managed to loosen them enough for him to slip free. They moved quickly after that. Adrian broke apart one of the old crates, creating kindling. Clara tore strips from her already ruined dress to use as fuel. They positioned everything near the door, far enough that they could control the fire, but close enough that smoke would billow into the corridor beyond. "Once that door opens," Adrian said, his voice low and urgent, "we go hard and fast. Don't hesitate. Don't look back. Just run." Clara nodded, her heart pounding. "Where do we run to?" "Lady Margaret's house. It's the only place that might offer protection. She has enough political clout that even Harrington will think twice about abducting us from her doorstep." He paused, meeting her eyes. "Are you ready?" No, Clara thought. She wasn't ready. Her head still throbbed from the blow, her body ached from the fight and the rough treatment afterward, and her hands shook with a combination of pain and adrenaline. But ready or not, this was happening. "Light it," she said. Adrian struck the flint they'd found among the broken tools, and the kindling caught immediately. Flames licked up the dried wood, and thick smoke began pouring from the makeshift fire. Within seconds, the cellar was filling with acrid gray clouds that made Clara's eyes water and her lungs burn. They pressed themselves against the wall beside the door, handkerchiefs tied over their faces, waiting. The smoke grew thicker, reaching toward the ceiling, finding every crack and crevice. Clara could hear coughing from the corridor outside, the guard reacting to the smoke seeping under the door. "Fire!" someone shouted. "There's a fire!" Footsteps pounded. Voices called out in alarm, and then the lock clicked. The door swung open, and a man rushed in. Not the guard, but one of Harrington's hired thugs, a thick-necked brute who'd probably been paid handsomely to keep them contained. He didn't see Clara and Adrian pressed against the wall beside the door. He was focused on the fire, reaching for one of the buckets of sand that must have been stored in the corridor. Adrian hit him from behind using a broken board from the crate. The man went down hard, and Clara was already through the door, running blind through the smoke-filled corridor. She heard Adrian behind her, heard shouts, and the sound of more footsteps converging on their location. The corridor opened into a larger room, a warehouse, as Clara had suspected. Old and poorly maintained, filled with crates and forgotten inventory. There were 3 more men in the space, all turning toward the commotion. One of them was already moving to block the exit. Clara didn't slow down. She grabbed a rusted metal pipe from a nearby workbench and swung it as hard as she could at the man blocking their path. It connected with his knee, and he went down screaming. Adrian shoved past him, and then they were outside, bursting into the gray light of late afternoon. The warehouse was in the dock district, just as Clara had guessed. The streets here were narrow and labyrinthine, lined with similar buildings and crowded with dock workers and merchants. It was the perfect place to disappear, if you knew where you were going. Clara didn't. But she ran anyway, Adrian beside her, both of them gasping for breath and bleeding from various injuries. Behind them she could hear Harrington's men giving chase, their boots pounding against cobblestones. "This way!" Adrian grabbed her hand and pulled her down an alley so narrow they had to turn sideways to fit through. They emerged onto a busier street, and Adrian didn't hesitate. He stepped into the path of a merchant's cart, forcing the driver to halt. "I'm the Duke of Blackridge," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority despite his battered appearance. "Take us to Lady Margaret Thornbury's estate, and I'll pay you double your usual rate." The merchant stared at them, at Adrian's bruised face, at Clara's torn dress and bleeding wrists, and Clara saw the moment of decision in his eyes. He could refuse, could worry about getting involved in whatever trouble they were clearly running from, or he could take the risk and earn more money than he'd normally see in a week. "Get in," the merchant said, jerking his thumb toward the back of the cart. "But if anyone asks, I never saw you." They climbed into the cart, burrowing beneath burlap sacks that smelled of fish and salt. The cart lurched into motion, and Clara pressed close to Adrian, both of them trying to control their ragged breathing. Through gaps in the burlap, she could see Harrington's men searching the street, questioning bystanders, but the merchant drove steadily onward without drawing attention. It took nearly an hour to reach Lady Margaret's estate, an hour during which Clara's mind raced through everything that had just happened. They'd escaped, but barely, and Harrington wouldn't give up easily. He'd regroup, adapt his strategy, come at them from a different angle. They'd bought themselves time, but not safety. When the cart finally stopped, Adrian pressed several coins into the merchant's hand, far more than he'd promised, and they stumbled out in front of Lady Margaret's gates. The footman who answered their frantic knocking took one look at them and immediately ushered them inside. Lady Margaret was in her sitting room, surrounded by a dozen people, lawyers, journalists, activists, all talking over each other in heated discussion. She stood when Clara and Adrian entered, her face going pale. "Merciful heavens," she breathed. "What happened to you?" Clara opened her mouth to explain, but suddenly the adrenaline that had been sustaining her drained away all at once. Her legs gave out, and she would have fallen if Adrian hadn't caught her. "Harrington," Adrian said, his voice hoarse. "He abducted us, tried to force us onto a ship to the colonies. We barely escaped." The room erupted in chaos, but Lady Margaret's voice cut through it all. "Get them medical attention, now, and someone send for the constable. We're filing charges." "No." Clara forced the word out, though her head was spinning and her vision kept blurring at the edges. "Not yet. If we go to the authorities now, Harrington will just claim we're lying. He'll say we're mentally unstable, that we're making false accusations because we're desperate. We need proof." "You have injuries," Lady Margaret pointed out. "That's proof of something. Of a street fight, maybe. Not of kidnapping by one of the kingdom's most powerful lords." Clara steadied herself, forcing her mind to work through the fog of exhaustion and pain. "We need to be strategic. We need to turn his own plan against him." One of the lawyers stepped forward, a sharp-faced woman named Portia Kendrick, who'd been helping draft legislation around education reform. "What did you have in mind?" Clara looked around the room at the assembled faces, journalists hungry for a story, lawyers eager to challenge the aristocracy's unchecked power, activists who'd been waiting for a chance to strike back at the system that kept them marginalized. An idea was forming, audacious and risky, but possibly their only real option. "We don't hide," Clara said. "We do the opposite. We go completely public with everything. The kidnapping, Harrington's threats, his plan to have us declared insane and institutionalized. We make it so visible, so documented that he can't make us disappear without proving our accusations true." "That's dangerous," Adrian said quietly. "Harrington has already shown he's willing to use violence. If we corner him publicly, he might do something desperate." "Good." Clara's voice was hard. "Let him be desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, and when he makes his, we'll be ready." Lady Margaret smiled slowly, and there was something fierce in her expression. "I like it, but we'll need to move fast. If Harrington realizes you've escaped, he'll be scrambling to cover his tracks. Then we don't give him time to cover them. Clara turned to the journalists. Can you have a story ready for tomorrow morning's papers? Something that lays out everything. The kidnapping, the threats, the corruption. One of the journalists, a young man named Daniel Frost, who'd been covering the education reform movement, nodded eagerly. I can have it on the front page, but I'll need details. Everything you can remember. You'll have it, Clara looked at the lawyers. And we'll need legal proceedings started immediately. Kidnapping charges, attempted unlawful confinement, conspiracy. Make it formal and public. Portia Kendrick was already making notes. What about protection? If Harrington is as dangerous as you say, you'll need guards. Already on it, Lady Margaret said. I have contacts who can provide security. As of right now, neither of you leaves this house without armed escort. The plans came together quickly after that, everyone working with focused urgency. A doctor was summoned to treat Clara's and Adrian's injuries. Cuts cleaned and bandaged, bruises examined. The bump on Clara's head deemed serious but not life-threatening. While they were being treated, they gave detailed accounts to the journalists and lawyers, holding nothing back. It was well past midnight when Clara finally found herself alone with Adrian in Lady Margaret's library. They'd been given rooms to rest in, but neither could sleep. Too much adrenaline still coursed through their systems, too many plans and contingencies spinning through their minds. We're going to war, Adrian said quietly, standing by the window and looking out at the darkened gardens. Against one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. This could destroy us. It already has destroyed us in some ways. Clara sat in one of the library's deep armchairs, her bandaged hands folded in her lap. The question is whether we let that destruction define us, or whether we use it as fuel. Adrian turned from the window, and in the firelight Clara could see the full extent of the damage from the fight, the bruises darkening across his face, the split lip, the way he held himself as if his ribs hurt with every breath. He looked nothing like the polished duke who'd stood in that ballroom 3 weeks ago. He looked broken and human and real. I never thanked you, he said, for forgiving me, for not leaving me in that cellar to face Harrington alone. We're in this together now. Clara met his gaze. But Adrian, I meant what I said at the forum. Forgiveness doesn't mean I'm going to give up my life and become yours. When this is over, if we survive this, I'm still going to run my schools. I'm still going to fight for what I believe in, with or without you. I know. He moved closer, sinking into the chair across from hers. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I'm asking if there's a way we can build something new, not a return to what might have been 20 years ago, something different, a partnership between equals. Clara studied him, searching for any hint of the arrogance or entitlement that had defined him in his youth. But all she saw was sincerity and exhaustion, and a kind of humility that could only come from being thoroughly humbled. Maybe, she said carefully, but not yet. First we survive. Then we can talk about what comes after. Adrian nodded, accepting the boundary she'd drawn. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, two people who'd once destroyed each other now trying to figure out how to exist in the same world without causing more damage. Clara's mind drifted back over the past 3 weeks. The gala, the public forum, the kidnapping. It felt like a lifetime compressed into days, like she'd lived through multiple versions of herself. The woman who'd walked into that ballroom had been strong and independent, but still carrying old wounds. The woman sitting in this library now was something different, scarred, yes, but no longer haunted. Fighting not against her past, but for her future. Tomorrow the war would begin in earnest. The newspapers would print their story, the legal proceedings would start, and Harrington would respond with everything he had. It would be brutal and public and potentially devastating. But for the first time since this all started, Clara felt ready. Not because she had all the answers or knew how to win, but because she'd finally accepted that some fights were worth the risk of losing everything. The morning papers exploded across the kingdom like a bomb. Daniel Frost had delivered on his promise, and then some. The front page of the Greymont Chronicle featured a detailed account of Clara's and Adrian's kidnapping, complete with quotes, medical documentation of their injuries, and damning details about Harrington's threats. Other newspapers picked up the story immediately, each adding their own editorials and analysis. By noon, the scandal had overshadowed everything else in the kingdom's public discourse. Clara watched from Lady Margaret's sitting room as a crowd began gathering outside the gates. Supporters, journalists, curious onlookers, all drawn by the unfolding drama. Inside the house, the activity was equally frenetic. Lawyers came and went, filing papers with the courts. Activists coordinated demonstrations, and messages poured in from across the kingdom, some supportive, many threatening, all of them testament to how thoroughly the story had captured public attention. Earl Harrington's response came at midday, delivered via an official statement to the press. He denied all accusations, claiming that Claire and Adrian had fabricated the kidnapping story to deflect from their own scandalous behavior. He produced witnesses who swore they'd seen Clara and Adrian leaving the riot voluntarily, without any sign of duress. He suggested, delicately but clearly, that Clara's history of emotional instability made her an unreliable witness. It was exactly the counterattack Clara had anticipated, but she'd prepared for it. Portia Kendrick called a press conference that afternoon, held on the steps of Lady Margaret's estate with dozens of journalists in attendance. Clara stood at the podium, Adrian and Lady Margaret flanking her, and she looked directly into the crowd as she spoke. Earl Harrington claims we fabricated our kidnapping. He says I'm emotionally unstable, that my accusations can't be trusted. This is precisely the tactic he described to us while we were imprisoned. Discredit the victims, control the narrative, use institutional power to silence dissent. She paused, letting the words sink in. But I'm not alone in this. The merchant who helped us escape has come forward and provided testimony. The warehouse owner has confirmed that Earl Harrington rented space in his building 2 days ago, and the doctor who treated our injuries has documented wounds consistent with violent abduction, not voluntary flight. She held up the medical report, and cameras flashed. We have evidence. We have witnesses. And we have something more powerful than that. We have a story that's already resonating with thousands of people across this kingdom. People who are tired of seeing the powerful escape consequences. People who understand that what happened to us could happen to anyone who challenges the established order. A journalist called out, "Miss Whitmore, are you calling for Earl Harrington's arrest?" "I'm calling for justice," Clara said firmly. "Whether that comes through arrest, legal prosecution, or public accountability, that's for the courts and the people to decide. But I won't be silenced, and I won't disappear no matter how badly some people wish I would." The crowd that had gathered outside the gates erupted in cheers. Clara looked out at them. Hundreds of faces, mostly women and working-class men, people who saw their own struggles reflected in hers. This wasn't just about her anymore. It had become something larger, a symbol of resistance against a system that had kept people powerless for generations. Over the next few days, the momentum shifted dramatically. More witnesses came forward, people who'd been hired by Harrington for various tasks that, in retrospect, clearly related to the kidnapping plot. A warehouse worker who'd been paid to keep quiet about unusual activity. A ship captain who admitted he'd been approached about providing secret passage to the colonies. Each piece of evidence chipped away at Harrington's denials. The Crown, which had initially tried to remain neutral, was forced to take action when Parliament demanded it. An official investigation was launched, and Earl Harrington was called to testify before a special committee. He complied, but his usual confidence was visibly shaken. The man who'd stood in that cellar radiating absolute certainty now looked cornered and desperate. Clara watched his testimony from Lady Margaret's sitting room, where it was being transcribed and delivered by messenger every hour. Harrington stuck to his denials, but he was clearly rattled by the weight of evidence mounting against him. When asked directly about his daughter Isadora's separation from Adrian, he became defensive, insisting it was a private family matter unrelated to the kidnapping allegations. But the committee wasn't satisfied with evasions. They pressed harder, and Harrington's composure began to crack. He accused Clara of being a manipulative seductress who'd orchestrated everything to destroy his family. He claimed Adrian was a weak-willed fool who'd been led astray by feminine wiles. And with each accusation, he revealed more of his own character. Arrogant, dismissive, convinced of his own untouchable superiority. The kingdom watched, and judgment formed. On the 5th day after the escape, Earl Harrington was formally charged with kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and conspiracy. It wasn't a complete victory. His wealth and connections meant he was released on bail, and the trial would likely drag on for months. But the charges themselves were unprecedented. A peer of the realm, one of the kingdom's most powerful lords, facing criminal prosecution for actions against a commoner and a duke who'd fallen from grace. The aristocracy was divided. Some rallied behind Harrington, seeing his persecution as an attack on their entire class. Others quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone who'd so thoroughly exposed the ugly mechanics of their power. And a small but growing number, mostly younger lords and ladies who'd been educated in more progressive circles, publicly supported Clara's cause, arguing that the old system was unsustainable and reform was necessary. Clara stood at the center of this upheaval, exhausted but unbroken. Her schools remained operational, now protected by public attention that made them too visible to attack directly. Enrollment actually increased as parents saw her as a symbol of resilience and change. And donations poured in from unexpected sources. Not just wealthy progressives, but working-class families who scraped together small amounts because they believed in what she represented. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the escape, Adrian found Clara in Lady Margaret's garden. She was sitting beneath an oak tree, reading through letters from prospective students, and she looked up as he approached. "You have visitors," he said. "3 of them. They're asking to see you." "More journalists?" "No." Adrian's expression was complicated, something between amusement and apprehension. "It's my sons, all 3 of them. They want to apologize." Clara set down the letters, her heart suddenly pounding. "What?" "Thomas, Marcus, and Edmund. They've been following the trial proceedings. They've seen the evidence, and apparently they've also been doing some thinking about their own behavior." Adrian sat down beside her. "Thomas is particularly ashamed. The bruise he gave me has been haunting him." "I don't need their apology," Clara said carefully. "This isn't about making peace with your family." "I know, but they need to give it anyway. Will you see them?" Clara wanted to refuse. She didn't want to face the sons of the man who'd once destroyed her, didn't want to hear explanations or justifications or awkward attempts at reconciliation. But she also remembered Thomas standing in her garden, his anger born from pain and confusion. These young men weren't responsible for what their father had done 20 years ago. They were just trying to navigate a world that had suddenly become far more complicated than the one they'd been raised to inherit. "All right," she said, "but only if you're there too." The meeting was awkward at first. Thomas, Marcus, and Edmund Blackridge stood in Lady Margaret's sitting room, looking profoundly uncomfortable. 3 young men in their early 20s who'd clearly spent the past weeks having their worldview thoroughly dismantled. Thomas's eyes went immediately to the bruise on his father's jaw, nearly faded now, but still visible. "Father," he said, his voice rough, "I'm sorry for hitting you, for trying to stop you from going to the forum, for—" He trailed off, struggling for words. "For believing the lies we'd been told about Miss Whitmore," Marcus finished. He was the middle son, quieter than Thomas, but with an intensity in his gaze. "We were raised to think that class divisions were natural, that people who challenged them were dangerous or delusional. But watching this unfold, seeing what Grandfather Harrington tried to do, it's made us question everything we thought we knew." Edmund, the youngest, stepped forward. He looked the most like his mother, delicate features, calculating eyes, but there was uncertainty in his expression. "Miss Whitmore, we don't expect you to forgive us, but we wanted you to know that we're not going to stand in our father's way anymore. If he wants to help with your schools, if he wants to use his influence for something meaningful, we support that, even if it means our family loses status." Clara studied the 3 of them, seeing genuine remorse and confusion and the beginnings of transformation. They were products of a system that had taught them their worth was inherent, that their privilege was deserved. Having that system exposed as corrupt and cruel had shaken them to their foundations. "I appreciate your apology," Clara said finally. "But what I need from you isn't guilt or support. What I need is for you to actually learn from this, to understand that the world you were born into isn't the world that should exist, and to use whatever privilege you still have to make things better, not just for people like you, but for everyone." Thomas nodded slowly. "How do we do that?" "Start by listening to people whose experiences are different from yours. To the women in your lives when they tell you about obstacles you've never had to face. To the working class families who can't afford to educate their daughters. Claire's voice was firm but not unkind. And then act. Support reform. Challenge your peers when they defend the old ways. Use your voices and your resources to amplify people who've been silenced. The three young men exchanged glances, and something unspoken passed between them. Then Thomas said, "We want to help with the schools. We have inheritance money from our mother's family. It's ours to use as we see fit. And we'd like to donate it to your expansion fund." Clara felt Adrian tense beside her, clearly not expecting this. She studied Thomas's face, searching for any hint of performance or manipulation, but saw only earnest determination. "That's generous," she said carefully. "But I need to be clear. This doesn't buy you absolution. Donating money doesn't erase the harm your family has caused or the system you've benefited from. It's a start, but only a start." "We understand," Marcus said. "We're not looking for absolution. We're looking for a way to be part of building something better." Clara looked at Adrian, who gave her a small nod. Then she turned back to his sons. "All right, we'll accept your donation, and if you're serious about helping, I can find ways for you to get involved in the actual work. Not just writing checks, but showing up, listening to students, understanding what we're trying to build." "We're serious," Edmund said, and his brothers echoed the sentiment. After they left, Clara and Adrian remained in the sitting room, both processing what had just happened. Finally, Adrian said, "You were harder on them than I expected." "They needed to hear it. Guilt is easy, change is hard. I wanted to make sure they understood the difference." Clara looked at him. "Is that all right?" Adrian smiled, genuine and warm. "It's perfect. You're perfect at this. At seeing through the performance to what's actually needed." Clara felt something shift between them, a subtle warming that had nothing to do with forgiveness or redemption and everything to do with recognition. Two people who'd started as strangers, become enemies, and were now slowly, carefully becoming something else. Partners, maybe. Allies, certainly, and possibly, eventually, more. But that was a thought for later. For now, there was still work to do. The trial date was set for 6 weeks out, and in the meantime, Clara threw herself back into her schools with renewed energy. The publicity had brought opportunities, new donors, political allies, invitations to speak at universities and progressive gatherings across the kingdom. She accepted many of them, using each platform to push for broader reforms: property rights for women, voting rights, labor protections, and universal education access. Adrian worked alongside her, though in a different capacity. He couldn't return to his former position in society. His public humiliation and Isadora's separation had made that impossible. But he discovered he didn't want to. Instead, he used his remaining connections to open doors for Clara's initiatives, to pressure reluctant politicians, to leverage his insider knowledge of how the aristocracy operated. He became, in essence, a traitor to his class. And he did it gladly. One evening, about 3 weeks before the trial was set to begin, Clara received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 30s, plainly dressed but carrying herself with quiet dignity, arrived at Lady Margaret's estate asking specifically for Clara. Her name was Clara Whitmore, Clara's cousin, her father's brother's daughter, who Clara hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. They met in the garden, and Sarah wasted no time with pleasantries. "I read about everything that's happened, the kidnapping, the trial, your work with the schools, and I realized I owed you an apology." Clara was confused. "For what?" "For abandoning you. After your father died, after the scandal, my family, we turned our backs on you. We were ashamed, afraid that association with you would taint us. We let you struggle alone because it was easier than standing with you." Sarah's eyes were wet. "I've regretted it every day since, and I wanted you to know that I'm here now, if you'll have me. Not because you're successful or famous, but because you're family, and I should have remembered that 20 years ago." Clara felt something crack open inside her. A wound she hadn't even realized was still there. The loss of her family after her father's death had been almost as devastating as the public humiliation. She'd told herself she didn't need them, that she was stronger alone. But hearing Sarah's apology, seeing genuine remorse in her cousin's face, Clara realized how much that abandonment had cost her. "I don't know if I can forgive that," Clara said honestly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." I understand. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a worn journal. But I wanted to give you this. It was your father's. He gave it to my father for safekeeping before he died, with instructions to give it to you when you were ready. My father never did. He died 5 years ago. But I found it among his things. I think you should have it. Clara took the journal with trembling hands. It was leather-bound and familiar. She remembered her father writing in it every evening, documenting his medical cases and his thoughts. She opened it carefully, and her father's handwriting swam before her eyes. The last entry was dated 3 days before his death. Clara read it slowly, her heart hammering. My Clara grows stronger every day, though she doesn't know it yet. The scandal has broken her spirit, but not her will. She thinks I'm dying of shame, but that's not true. I'm dying of a heart condition I've hidden from her because I didn't want her burdened with more pain. But I'm not ashamed of her. I'm proud. She loved boldly and honestly, and there's no shame in that. The shame belongs to a world that punishes women for having hearts. I hope one day she finds her way back to that boldness. I hope she learns that surviving isn't the same as living. I hope she forgives herself for being human. Clara's vision blurred with tears. All these years she'd believed her father died because of her scandal, that she'd killed him with her recklessness. But he'd been sick, and he'd been proud of her. Even at the end, even in his final thoughts, he'd believed in her. She looked up at Sarah, unable to speak. He never stopped loving you, Sarah said quietly. And neither did I. I was just too much of a coward to show it. Clara clutched the journal to her chest, letting the tears fall freely now. All the armor she'd built, all the strength she'd cultivated, it suddenly felt less necessary. She didn't have to be invulnerable. She could be human and still survive. Thank you, she managed finally, for bringing this to me. Sarah nodded and left quietly, leaving Clara alone in the garden with her father's words and a grief she'd never properly processed. She sat there until dark, reading and rereading the journal entries, letting herself mourn not just her father, but the girl she'd been, the one who'd loved boldly and paid for it dearly. When Adrian found her hours later, she was still sitting beneath the oak tree, the journal open on her lap. Are you all right? He asked gently. I don't know, Clara said honestly, but I think I will be. He sat beside her, not touching but present, and they watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Two people who'd once destroyed each other, learning slowly how to exist together without causing more damage. Learning that strength didn't mean never breaking. It meant breaking and choosing to rebuild anyway. The trial was 3 weeks away. Earl Harrington was preparing his defense, his lawyers no doubt crafting strategies to undermine Clara's credibility and escape consequences. The kingdom watched and waited, divided and uncertain about what justice should look like in a case that challenged everything they thought they knew about power and privilege. But sitting in that garden, holding her father's journal and feeling Adrian's quiet presence beside her, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in 20 years. Hope. Not the naive hope of youth, but something harder and more resilient. The hope that came from having survived the worst and discovering you were still capable of building something beautiful from the ruins. The night before the trial, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of her room in Lady Margaret's estate, watching rain streak the glass and blur the street lamps below into halos of golden light. Tomorrow she would face Earl Harrington in open court. Tomorrow, the kingdom would watch as a commoner accused one of its most powerful lords of crimes that, until recently, would have been unthinkable to prosecute. Tomorrow, everything she'd built could crumble or be vindicated. The door opened softly behind her. She turned to find Adrian standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the late hour. Can't sleep either? He asked. Clara shook her head. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that cellar, or back in the ballroom 20 years ago. My mind keeps cycling through every terrible outcome, every way this could go wrong. Adrian entered the room, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into his face. He'd been working tirelessly for weeks, meeting with lawyers, coordinating with witnesses, using every remaining connection he had to ensure the trial would be fair. It had aged him, but not in a diminishing way. If anything, the hardship had stripped away his aristocratic polish to reveal something more substantial underneath. I've been thinking, he said quietly, about what you said in the garden, about forgiveness not being surrender, about how you're still going to run your schools and fight for what you believe in, with or without me. Clara's pulse quickened. Adrian, let me finish. He moved closer and she could see vulnerability in his eyes. You were right to say that. You were right to maintain your boundaries, to refuse to let me use you as some kind of redemption project. But I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the court decides, I'm not going anywhere. Not because I think you need me, but because I need this. I need to be part of something that matters. Even if that means spending the rest of my life working in the background supporting your vision without any claim on you. Clara felt something shift in her chest, the last wall she'd been maintaining beginning to crack. That's not what I want either. Then what do you want? It was the question she'd been avoiding for weeks. What did she want? She'd spent so long defining herself in opposition, not weak, not broken, not the girl who'd been humiliated, that she'd forgotten to define herself in affirmation. Who was Clara Whitmore when she wasn't fighting to survive? I want a partner, she said slowly, feeling her way through the truth. Not someone who saves me or someone I have to save. Not someone who kneels at my feet or expects me to kneel at theirs. I want someone who stands beside me as an equal, who respects what I've built and is willing to help build more. Someone who's done the work to become a person I can actually trust. Adrian's expression was unreadable. And do you think I could be that person, eventually? I don't know, Clara said honestly, but I think maybe we could try. After the trial, after we've survived whatever comes next, we could try to build something new, not a recreation of what might have been, but something we create together from this moment forward. She saw relief flood Adrian's face, followed by something deeper, hope, fragile but genuine. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His touch was gentle, reverent, nothing like the careless certainty of his youth. I'd like that, he said. Very much. They stood together in the quiet room, rain drumming against the windows. Two people who'd once been each other's destruction, now contemplating the possibility of becoming each other's restoration. It felt precarious and precious, like something that could shatter with one wrong word. But it also felt real in a way nothing had felt in a long time. The moment was broken by urgent knocking on the door. Lady Margaret burst in without waiting for permission, her silver hair disheveled and her expression grave. We have a problem, she said. Harrington's lawyers just filed a motion to dismiss all charges. They're claiming diplomatic immunity. Apparently, Harrington holds some archaic title that technically grants him protection from prosecution. The motion is scheduled for emergency hearing at dawn, before the trial even begins. Clara felt ice flood her veins. Can they do that? They can try. And given how desperate they are, they might succeed. Lady Margaret's jaw was tight. We need Portia and the legal team assembled immediately. If we lose this motion, the trial never happens. Harrington walks free, and everything we've built collapses. The next few hours were a blur of frantic preparation. Portia Kendrick and her team worked through the night, researching precedents and crafting counter-arguments. The archaic title Harrington was claiming dated back 3 centuries, granted to his ancestor for military service during a forgotten war. It had never been revoked, technically remained valid, and carried with it protections from criminal prosecution for all direct descendants. It's a legal absurdity, Portia said, her eyes red from exhaustion and anger. These kinds of immunity clauses were meant for foreign diplomats, not domestic lords trying to escape justice. But the law is on the books, and Harrington's lawyers are betting that the judge will prioritize legal precedent over public outrage. So what do we do? Clara asked. We argue that the immunity doesn't apply to crimes committed against citizens of the realm, that it was intended to protect diplomats from prosecution in foreign courts, not to create an untouchable class above the law. Portia paused. But it's weak. The language in the original statute is vague enough that it could be interpreted either way. Adrian, who'd been silent during most of the discussion, suddenly spoke up. What if we prove that the title itself is invalid? Everyone turned to look at him. What do you mean? Lady Margaret asked. These old titles, they usually come with conditions. Military service, land maintenance, loyalty to the crown. If we can show that Harrington or his ancestors failed to meet those conditions, the title could be deemed forfeit, and without the title, there's no immunity. Portia's eyes lit up. That could work, but we'd need evidence of breach, and we'd need it fast. The hearing is in 4 hours. I know someone who might help. Adrian stood, already moving toward the door. My uncle, my father's younger brother. He's spent decades researching family histories and genealogies. If there's dirt on the Harrington lineage, he'll know where to find it. He left at a run, and Clara felt a strange mixture of anxiety and admiration. This was what partnership looked like. Not one person carrying the burden alone, but two people bringing their different strengths to bear on a common problem. The sky was beginning to lighten when Adrian returned, carrying a stack of old documents and looking triumphant despite his exhaustion. Got it, he announced, spreading papers across Lady Margaret's dining table. The title Harrington's claiming, Duke of Westmarch, comes with a requirement that the holder maintain a military garrison and provide troops to the crown during wartime. But there hasn't been a garrison at Westmarch in over 100 years. The property was sold off in pieces, and the family has provided exactly 0 military support during the last 3 conflicts the kingdom was involved in. Portia grabbed the documents, scanning them rapidly. This is perfect. The title has been technically forfeit for generations. It just was never formally revoked because no one challenged it. If we can get these documents admitted as evidence, we gut his entire defense, Lady Margaret finished, her smile fierce. Let's move. The emergency hearing took place at dawn in a courtroom packed with journalists, activists, and members of the aristocracy who'd come to watch what they assumed would be Harrington's escape from justice. Clara sat in the front row beside Adrian, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles went white. Across the aisle, Earl Harrington sat with his lawyers, looking confident despite the dark circles under his eyes. He caught Clara's gaze once and smiled, a cold, contemptuous expression that said he still believed he was untouchable. The judge entered. Lord Justice Pemberton, an older man known for his strict interpretation of the law. Clara's heart sank slightly. A judge who valued precedent over justice might be exactly the wrong person to hear this case. Harrington's lead counsel, a slick aristocrat named Reginald Ashford, presented the immunity argument with practiced eloquence. He spoke about the sanctity of ancient titles, the importance of maintaining legal traditions, the danger of allowing mob sentiment to override centuries of established law. It was a masterful performance designed to make immunity sound not like privilege, but like constitutional necessity. Then it was Portia's turn. She stood slowly, and Clara could see the exhaustion in her movements. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and unwavering. Your Honor, the defense would have us believe that Earl Harrington exists above the law, that his ancestors' military service 300 years ago grants him the right to kidnap, threaten, and attempt to destroy the lives of citizens with impunity. This is not justice. This is tyranny. She approached the bench, carrying Adrian's documents. But more importantly, the immunity the defense claims doesn't even exist. The title of Duke of Westmarch comes with explicit conditions. Conditions that the Harrington family has failed to meet for over a century. The required military garrison was disbanded. The lands were sold. The family has provided no military support to the crown in living memory. By the very laws that created this title, it should have been forfeit generations ago. Ashford jumped to his feet. Objection! These documents are not authenticated, and this line of argument wasn't included in the prosecution's original brief. Because we only discovered the breach last night, Portia shot back. But the documents are authentic. They come from the Royal Archives, and we have the chief archivist prepared to testify to their validity. The question before this court is simple. Does Earl Harrington hold a valid title that grants immunity, or is he claiming protection under a forfeited honor he has no legal right to? Lord Justice Pemberton studied the documents, his expression unreadable. The courtroom held its collective breath. Clara felt Adrian's hand find hers under the table, and she gripped it like a lifeline. Finally, the judge looked up. The court will take a 30-minute recess to review these documents and consider the arguments. We reconvene at 7 o'clock. Those 30 minutes felt like an eternity. Clara paced in the hallway outside the courtroom, unable to sit still, while Adrian stood with his back against the wall, eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been simply exhaustion. Lady Margaret spoke in low tones with Portia, while journalists tried desperately to get comments from anyone involved. When they filed back into the courtroom, Clara felt like she might be sick. Everything hinged on the next few minutes. If Pemberton accepted the immunity claim, Harrington walked free and could continue using his power to destroy anyone who challenged him. If he rejected it, the trial would proceed, and with it, the possibility of actual justice. Lord Justice Pemberton took his seat and surveyed the packed courtroom with stern eyes. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented by the prosecution," he began, his voice carrying absolute authority. "The documents from the Royal Archives are authentic and clearly establish the conditions under which the title of Duke of Westmarch was granted. They also clearly establish that those conditions have not been met for over 100 years. Clara's heart leapt, but she forced herself to remain still, to listen. The defense argues that the failure to meet these conditions is irrelevant because the title was never formally revoked. However, the law is clear. Titles granted conditionally revert to the Crown automatically upon breach of those conditions. Formal revocation is a courtesy, not a requirement. The title Earl Harrington claims, and the immunity it supposedly grants, is legally forfeit and has been for generations." Pemberton's gaze settled on Harrington, and there was steel in it. "More importantly, this court finds the entire premise of absolute immunity abhorrent to the principles of justice. No person in this kingdom should be above the law, regardless of their lineage or titles. The motion to dismiss is denied. This trial will proceed." The courtroom erupted. Harrington's face went purple with rage, and his lawyers immediately began calling for appeals, objections, anything to stop what was now inevitable. But Pemberton gavelled the room back to order with sharp cracks that echoed like gunshots. "The trial begins in 2 hours," he announced. "I suggest both sides use that time to prepare their cases. And I warn you, this court will not tolerate any further attempts to subvert justice through legal technicalities. We're here to determine the truth, and that's exactly what we're going to do." Clara stumbled out of the courtroom in a daze, barely registering the journalists shouting questions or the activists cheering in the hallway. They'd won the first battle. The trial would happen. Justice was still possible. Adrian caught her as her knees buckled, supporting her weight. "We did it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The trial happens." "No," Clara corrected, looking up at him through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "We proved he's not untouchable. Now we have to prove he's guilty." The trial lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony, evidence, cross-examination, and legal maneuvering. Clara took the stand and told her story, all of it, from the summer 20 years ago through the kidnapping and escape. Harrington's lawyers tried to break her, to paint her as an obsessed woman seeking revenge, but she held firm. She answered every question with calm precision, never raising her voice, never showing weakness. Adrian testified next, admitting his own failures and describing Harrington's threats in detail. The merchant who'd helped them escape testified. The warehouse owner testified. Even Thomas Blackridge took the stand, describing how his grandfather had tried to manipulate him into stopping Adrian from going to the forum. The evidence mounted, physical, testimonial, documentary. And through it all, Harrington sat at the defense table looking more and more cornered. His lawyers threw everything they had at the prosecution's case, but nothing stuck. The truth was too solid, too well documented, too publicly visible to be undermined. On the third day, Harrington himself took the stand. He was a terrible witness. Under Portia's withering cross-examination, he became defensive and arrogant, insisting that everything he'd done was justified because Clara and Adrian were threats to social order. He admitted to renting the warehouse but claimed it was for storage. He admitted to arranging ship passage but said it was for business purposes. And when pressed about the threats he'd made in the cellar, he made a fatal error. He sneered and said, "I told them what any rational person would, that people who challenge the natural order deserve whatever consequences come their way." The courtroom went silent. Even Harrington's lawyers looked stricken. Portia leaned forward. "So you admit that you believe anyone who challenges what you call the natural order deserves to be kidnapped, threatened, and potentially institutionalized against their will?" Harrington realized too late what he'd said. "That's not what I meant. But it's what you said, Lord Harrington. It's what you believe, and it's exactly what you tried to do to Miss Whitmore and the Duke." Portia's voice was quiet but devastating. No further questions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Clara spent that time in a private room with Adrian, Lady Margaret, and Portia, unable to eat or speak or do anything but wait. The outcome felt inevitable at this point, but she'd learned the hard way that nothing was certain until it was finished. When the bailiff finally called them back to the courtroom, Clara's legs felt like water. She walked to her seat in the front row, hyper-aware of the hundreds of eyes watching her, the journalists ready to document every moment of either vindication or crushing defeat. Lord Justice Pemberton addressed the jury foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of kidnapping, how do you find the defendant?" The foreman looked directly at Harrington. "Guilty." The word detonated through the courtroom like a bomb. Clara felt the world tilt, felt Adrian's hand find hers again, felt something that had been clenched tight inside her chest for 20 years finally begin to release. On the charge of unlawful confinement? Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy? Guilty. 3 times guilty. 3 times the kingdom's legal system had looked at one of its most powerful lords and said, "You are not above the law. You are not untouchable. You will face consequences." Harrington sat frozen at the defense table, his face ashen. His lawyers were already preparing appeals, but everyone in the room knew what this meant. Even if the conviction was later overturned on some technicality, even if Harrington managed to escape prison, he would never recover from this. His power was broken, his reputation destroyed. And most importantly, the precedent was set. The aristocracy could be held accountable. Lord Justice Pemberton sentenced Harrington to 5 years in prison and stripped him of all remaining titles and honors. It wasn't a lifetime sentence, but it was enough. Enough to show the kingdom that justice was possible. Enough to prove that power had limits. As guards led Harrington from the courtroom, he looked back at Clara one last time. She expected to see hatred or defiance, but instead saw something else. Defeat. Complete and total. The man who'd once been so certain of his untouchable status now understood what it felt like to be powerless. Clara felt no joy in his destruction, only relief and exhaustion, and the overwhelming sense that a chapter of her life had finally, definitively closed. Outside the courthouse, thousands of people had gathered. When Clara emerged with Adrian, Lady Margaret, and Portia, the crowd erupted in cheers so loud she could barely think. People pressed forward, wanting to touch her, to thank her, to tell her what the verdict meant to them. Women wept. Men shouted themselves hoarse. And through it all, Clara stood in the midst of chaos, feeling strangely calm. A journalist managed to push through the crowd, shouting over the noise. "Miss Whitmore, what do you want to say to everyone who supported you?" Clara looked out at the sea of faces, working-class families, progressive aristocrats, students from her schools, people she'd never met but who saw their own struggles reflected in hers. And she understood finally what she'd been fighting for all along. Not just her schools or her reputation or revenge against Harrington. She'd been fighting for the radical idea that everyone, regardless of birth or gender or class, deserved dignity and justice and the right to pursue their own futures. "I want to say thank you," she called out, her voice carrying across the crowd. "But I also want to say this isn't the end. This is the beginning. We've proven that change is possible, that the old systems can be challenged. Now we have to keep pushing, keep fighting, keep building a world where trials like this one aren't necessary because everyone is already treated with fairness and respect." The crowd roared its approval, and Clara let herself be swept along by it, by the energy and hope and righteous anger of people who'd been waiting generations for proof that their struggles mattered. That evening, back at Lady Margaret's estate, Clara finally allowed herself to collapse. She sat in the library with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, staring into the fire and trying to process everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, she'd been kidnapped and nearly destroyed. Today, she'd helped convict one of the kingdom's most powerful lords. The whiplash was almost unbearable. Adrian found her there, looking as exhausted as she felt. He'd changed out of his formal court clothes into something simpler, and there was a lightness to his expression that she'd never seen before, like a weight had been lifted. "May I join you?" he asked. Clara nodded, and he settled into the chair across from hers, both of them watching the fire in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, Adrian said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about building something new together, about trying. And? And I want to start by being completely honest about where I am." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression open and vulnerable. "I'm not the man I was 20 years ago, but I'm not yet the man I want to be either. I've spent so much of my life hiding behind duty and propriety that I'm still learning how to just exist without those shields. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to say the wrong thing or fall back into old patterns. And I need you to know that if you give me a chance, if you let me try to be your partner, it won't be perfect. It'll be messy and hard and sometimes frustrating." Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. This was what she'd needed to hear, not promises of perfection, but acknowledgement of reality. Not grand gestures, but honest vulnerability. "I'm not perfect either," she said quietly. "I'm still learning how to let someone in without giving up my independence. I'm still learning that strength doesn't mean never needing help. And I'm terrified that if I let myself care about you again, you'll hurt me the way you did before." "I can't promise I won't hurt you," Adrian said, "but I can promise that I'll never do it on purpose. And that if I do, I'll own it and try to make it right. That's all I can offer, honesty and effort and the commitment to keep trying even when it's hard." Clara set down her teacup and stood, crossing to where Adrian sat. She looked down at him, this man who'd once destroyed her and was now trying so hard to become someone worthy of her trust. And she made a choice, not because she was certain it would work out, but because she was finally brave enough to risk being hurt again. "Then let's try," she said. "No expectations, no guarantees, just two people who've been through hell choosing to build something from the ashes." Adrian stood, and they faced each other in the firelight, close enough that Clara could see the silver threading through his hair, the lines around his eyes, all the marks of years lived and mistakes survived. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face gently in his hands. "May I kiss you?" Clara's answer was to close the distance between them. The kiss was nothing like the one they'd shared 20 years ago behind the stables. No urgency or stolen passion or desperate secrecy. This kiss was slow and careful and honest, two people learning each other anew, taking their time because they finally had time to take. Clara felt tears on her cheeks and wasn't sure if they were hers or his. Probably both. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said quietly. "Not the girl you were, but the woman you've become. The one who survived and built something beautiful from pain. The one who refuses to be diminished or silenced. That's who I love." Clara felt the words settle into her bones, felt the truth of them. This wasn't the naive love of youth. This was something earned through suffering and growth and the slow, painful work of becoming people capable of actually seeing each other. "I love you too," she said. "But I'm still scared." "Good. So am I. That means we're paying attention." Adrian kissed her forehead gently. "We'll figure it out as we go. Together." 6 months later, Clara stood in the grand ballroom of the Blackridge estate, the same ballroom where she'd been humiliated 20 years earlier. But today the space looked entirely different. The portraits of stern ancestors had been taken down and replaced with artwork from students at the Whitmore Academy. The crystal chandeliers still glittered, but the room was filled with people who'd never before been welcome here. Working-class families, activists, progressive politicians, and dozens of young women whose lives had been changed by access to education. This wasn't a ball. It was the opening celebration of the Blackridge Institute for Advanced Studies, a new university built on the estate's grounds, funded by the combined resources of Clara's schools, Lady Margaret's fortune, and the Blackridge family wealth. It would offer scholarships to students regardless of gender or class, focusing on science, medicine, and social reform. Adrian had signed over the estate completely, transforming his family's symbol of aristocratic power into something that actually served the people. Clara moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions about the curriculum, and she felt a bone-deep satisfaction. This was what victory looked like, not defeating one man or winning one trial, but transforming the very systems that had once crushed her. She found Adrian on the terrace, looking out over the grounds where construction crews were putting finishing touches on the university buildings. He'd lost weight over the past months, the result of long hours and intense work, but he looked happier than she'd ever seen him. "Having second thoughts?" Clara asked, joining him at the railing. "About giving up the estate?" "Not even slightly." Adrian turned to her, smiling. "Do you know what Thomas said when he saw the plans for the university? He said he was proud to see the family name finally mean something worthwhile. Coming from him, that meant everything." Clara took his hand, and they stood together watching the sun set over what had once been the site of her greatest humiliation and was now the foundation of her greatest achievement. Lady Margaret joined them on the terrace, followed by Portia and several of the Academy's senior teachers. They raised glasses of champagne in a quiet toast to survival, to justice, to the long, hard work of change. Later that evening, when most of the guests had departed, Clara found herself alone in the ballroom where it had all begun. She walked to the exact spot where she'd stood 20 years ago, young and desperate and broken, and she tried to imagine what that girl would think if she could see what her future held. Would she have believed that the pain would eventually transform into power? That the man who destroyed her would become her partner in building something beautiful? That she would not just survive but thrive, creating a legacy that would outlast any scandal? Clara didn't know. But she hoped that girl, wherever she existed in memory and time, understood something crucial. Being broken wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of becoming something stronger. Adrian appeared beside her, and without speaking, he offered his hand. Clara took it, and they began to dance. No music, no audience. Just two people moving together in the space where they'd once destroyed each other, now choosing to create something new with every step. Outside the ballroom windows, lights from the university buildings glowed against the darkness, beacons of possibility in a world that was slowly, painfully, but definitely changing. And in the same place where Clara Whitmore had once fallen, she now stood as an equal, respected, chosen, and powerful. Not because someone had rescued her, not because she'd been granted permission to succeed, but because she'd taken her own survival and transformed it into something that would help others do the same. This was the real victory. Not revenge, not vindication, but the knowledge that she had turned her greatest wound into the foundation for a better world. And standing in that ballroom with Adrian's hand in hers, Clara finally allowed herself to believe that the past no longer had power over her future. She was free. They both were. And the best part was that this wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning of everything they would build together. Not a second chance at the past, but a completely new future, earned through courage and won through the kind of strength that came only from having survived the fall and chosen to climb back up anyway. In the same place where Clara had once been broken, she now stood whole, not because the breaking had never happened, but because she'd learned that survival wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about transforming it into purpose. And that purpose would light the way for every person who came after her, proving that no matter how far you fall, you always have the power to rise again.